Welcome to another episode of Tyrannus Hall. This is a platform for a number of us to have gracious, informative discussions about the calling that the church has today to be missional in today's world, to promote the gospel. My name is Bill Dejong. I'm a pastor at Blessings Christian Church. My co-host, Winston Bosch, is absent today. He's on vacation. We are both ministers in the Canadian Reformed churches, and this is a podcast intended especially for members of Canadian Reformed churches as we reflect together on the calling of the church to promote the gospel in a largely secular society. We are thrilled today to have a special guest. Tim Challies is a author and blogger located just outside of Toronto. He's quite popular in evangelical circles, and he has an upbringing in the Canadian Reformed Church. So we want to engage him a little bit about that upbringing and have him comment on the status of Canadian evangelicalism today. So thank you for joining us, and we really hope you enjoy this dialogue that we have with Tim Challies. Well, we're delighted today to have as a special guest to Tyrannus Hall, Tim Challies. Tim Challies is a blogger and an author and a conference speaker, and he's situated right here in Southern Ontario, and so we thought he would make a very engaging conversation partner for us today. And Tim, I don't know if you know this, but we were actually part of the same church for a while. I believe you spent some time in the Ancaster Canadian Reformed Church. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, first Toronto and then Ancaster.
Yeah, so I was also in the Ancaster Church. I'm slightly older than you are. You probably don't remember me, but I remember your family quite fondly. I even went out for coffee once with John Van Popte and your father, and I just remember your father being very, very astute, and so it was very interesting to listen to him. In any case, welcome to Tyrannus Hall. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. Glad to be here. This should be fun.
Yeah. I wonder actually if we could begin with any memories that you might have of your upbringing in Canadian Reformed churches. This is a podcast that's designed for the membership of Canadian Reformed churches. But, you know, we're doing some reevaluation of how we've done ministry, and hopefully we're improving along the way. But I'd be kind of curious to hear from you what your memories are, both good and bad, or maybe there's only bad. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess you'd have to go all the way back to when I grew up in the Christian Reformed schools, I guess. Willowdale Christian School. Ben Harsport was the principal at the time. And that was, I think, my first introduction to the Dutch world and to being the only non-Dutch person in a crowd. And my parents are really Presbyterian at heart. They always were. And yet Presbyterianism had sort of fallen on hard times in the Toronto area. And so they met Ron Gleason and really came to respect him. So that's how we ended up being part of Bethel Canadian Reformed Church. Of course, my dad subsequently went to the theological college, and so we moved to Ancaster and settled into Ancaster Canadian Reformed. So lots of memories. My whole childhood, basically all the way up till I was about 18 or 20 years old, it's all Canadian Reformed, really. And generally fond. You know, I think my memories are generally good. And there's certain things I really, really have appreciated and loved, and things that have shaped me, the catechizing, the theological instruction, I think, even more so than the week-by-week preaching. I think that's what really stands out as having shaped me. And, you know, I'm Baptist now, and I sometimes laugh about people in the Baptist world suddenly discovering catechisms and discovering creeds, discovering confessions, and getting excited about it. Well, no, I know that. And, you know, Baptists starting to sing question and answer 1 of the Heidelberg Catechism. Well, I had to memorize that several times over when I was young. And so I think my upbringing in the Canadian Reformed laid a very good foundation for life. So I'm very grateful.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, Tim. Did you go to catechism classes then at the church?
Yeah. With definitely I don't think I did in Toronto. I think I was still too young, but in Ancaster, yeah, with Reverend Aceman at the time. And then I can't remember who took over. He shifted to another church, and one of the teachers from Guido. I went to Christian school for 8th grade once we moved to Ancaster, and then I went to Guido for grades 9, 10, and 11 before transferring to the public school for grade 12. So yeah, it was sometime in there I got my catechism and all that good stuff.
Oh, that's very interesting. I have a lot of memories from Richard Aceman teaching catechism as well. He was also my pastor, and we may have been receiving catechism instruction at the same time, albeit in different grades, but he was quite formative in terms of my own life. And I think I began to entertain a call to the ministry already back in those years when I was a teenager receiving catechism class. What are your memories of catechism class back then? Do you remember some of the, like, what did the assignments consist of, or the test? I have very distinct memories of those. I'm just wondering if you do too.
My memories are very non-distinct. The clear memory I have is cheating on one of my recitations of a question and answer, finding a way of kind of having a crib sheet and cheating my way through it. So that's one of my very few clear memories. And then just running around. That was back when the church was meeting at Redeemer, and so kind of we got a few minutes of freedom afterwards and kind of running around. So I remember the specific room we met in. I don't remember. I know it shaped me, but I don't have clear memories of the specifics of the learning we got there, sadly.
Well, Tim, I've got good news for you. You're forgiven. I remember we had to memorize Lord's Days, and I remember Richard Aceman would give us kind of an outline of his presentation, and it was just very theological. We had to learn proof texts. We had to know doctrines. And I think now, we probably got to do a little better at relational pastoring, but I'm not sure we need to lose any of the doctrinal formation that we received. I do think that was quite healthy. Mm-hmm. So if we could now shift to Canadian evangelicalism and just reflect a little bit about what you see the Lord doing in the evangelical church. What are maybe some of the concerning trends? What are some of the encouraging trends that you're seeing as somebody with his ear to the ground who interacts with a lot of people?
Yeah, one more Canadian Reformed thing before I move on, which is I owe my wife to the Canadian Reformed in a roundabout way, which is she was a neighbor to Mr. Van Doren, who at the time was, of course, principal of Guido. And it was through my friend Mark Van Doren. I went to his house once and saw this girl running around the neighborhood playing with the neighborhood kids. And that was then went to Ancaster High that shortly thereafter, a few months later, and saw her again. And we started talking, and she came to know the Lord and is my wife now. So the Canadian Reformed has been kind to me in more ways than one. In terms of Canadian evangelicalism, Canadian Christianity, I think one of the main things we just have to admit is Canada is a vast country that is regionalized. And so the Christianity or the evangelicalism of the West Coast is going to be very different from the East Coast, which is going to be very different from the central part of Canada. And then, of course, Quebec, which is always sort of its own thing as well. So I think the Lord is at work in every region of the country. I'm not as familiar with the territories and don't see or hear of as much from up there. But no, the Lord's at work all across the country. But maybe one of the concerns is that what binds people together across Canada's region is more north-south connections than east-west ones, which is to say our commonality tends to be American evangelicalism and American church leaders. We both go to a Ligonier conference in Orlando, and that's where we meet someone from the other side of the country, or a gospel coalition, or Together for the Gospel, or any of those events. So I still think as Canadians, we're quite focused on American evangelicalism, not Canadian Christianity.
Yeah, in some ways, the Canadian evangelical churches, and this is probably true of Canadians in general, we have a bit of an inferiority complex next to the U.S. And, when we think of great preachers and trustworthy Christian leaders, we almost always think of names south of the border. And yet, here in Canada, we have some great aspiring theologians, very faithful pastors, some of whom are very gifted communicators. I think we have resources and talent within our own country that we've largely ignored just because they're not known. What do you think is the remedy to that might help us kind of reinvest more along national lines than continental lines?
Yeah, in a sense, I don't know that there needs to be a remedy. I don't know that we need a Canadian church. If it's regionalized and doing well, that's probably fine. It's very hard for somebody from Vancouver to really influence or care for somebody in St. John's. They're just so geographically separated. But if you have a strong Atlantic Canada church or group of churches that can form some sort of relationship and support one another, care for one another, pray with one another, all those sorts of things, even do conferences together, maybe that's fine. I think America has more of a celebrity culture, I would say, than Canada, and has 10 times the population, or 9 times or whatever it is. So if you go online, you're going to find 9 times the mentions for a person there versus in Canada, just by weight of the volume of people there. So I think Canada won't ever be able to, quote unquote, compete in that way, but I don't think we need to. We're a different culture. I don't think we're as celebrity driven. I don't think we crave national leaders in quite the same way. But I just like to see Canadians forming relationships on a more local or regional level, and sort of figuring out what the theological boundary is within which we want to have that kind of fellowship and co-laboring for the gospel, and then just do all we can to love, care for, support one another.
Well, I suppose that my question made an assumption, and you may want to challenge this assumption, but my assumption is that the cultural landscape is somewhat different here in Canada compared to the US, where we might face challenges in common across the country that would not be faced by our American counterparts. I think what you're saying makes total sense for there to be regional collaboration, and that may cross the border. But do you see the challenges faced by Canadian churches on a different scale than those faced by American churches?
Yeah, we certainly have different challenges here. The U.S. is different because there's a Bible Belt there isn't in Canada, and politicians go and seek the Christian vote or the evangelical vote. It's an important part of the political process in America in a way I just don't think it is in Canada. It's, somebody can be elected in Canada and not appeal whatsoever to the Christian vote and still do just fine and get a majority government, even if he really forsakes the Christian vote, does all he can to say, I don't want that vote, he'll still have enough people that he can get swept into power. And so I think it's just very different that way on that kind of political level. I don't know if that's what you're asking, but I think as Canadians, we just have to we're so influenced by America for good and for ill. We have to be careful in a lot of conversations, political, racial, economic, all sorts of things, just to ensure we're saying, okay, what about that is distinctly American? And how should Canadians interpret that? What's different about our context here? We I think face the temptation to be a little bit lazy there and just directly import things that don't necessarily apply to us.
Yeah, correct. No, I was thinking more in terms of Canada just being a more secular country. On the other hand, I don't know that we're any more secular than Boston or New York City or any one of these great American cities. There's probably little difference on opinion if you were to survey people on the street. But that's the narrative that you often hear, at least. And it might be attributable, as you said, simply to the fact that the U.S. has a Bible Belt, and it's very hard to find a belt of any sort here in Canada like that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, the lack of celebrity pastors in Canada, which I also see as a very good thing. I wonder if you can speculate why that hasn't happened in Canada, why you haven't had this phenomenon, at least to the same degree that you have in the US, of celebrity pastors.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, except that I don't think we have the maybe Christian infrastructure to create celebrities within Canada, and maybe don't have the Christian population to make somebody a celebrity. We may just not have the numbers. And that's especially so when you think a celebrity who's within the Reformed Baptist world may have zero appeal in the Canadian Reformed world, and vice versa. We tend to be pretty regionalized with our celebrities as well. Meanwhile, we do look to the South and we do find our celebrities there. So maybe we don't have much need for them in Canada. But then also, I just don't think we're a celebrity culture in the same way. We don't build heroes quite the same as they might in America. That's neither good nor bad. It's just a cultural difference. We're a skeptical and pessimistic people maybe, and are more attuned to just waiting for somebody to fall. Or, I mean, sometimes we show respect for people by not lauding them. That maybe more reserved way of, I'll honor you, but I'm not going to ask you to sign my Bible. I'm not going to ask you to sign my T-shirt or something. It's just more of a Canadian reserve, just a different national personality, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you're correct about that. I think there is something culturally different. And sometimes when I'm in the US, and this isn't so much the case anymore with the demise of daily newspapers, but in the US at least, you'd often see churches advertised with a picture of the pastor and the name of the pastor in bold. And that's generally not the way that the church has ever been advertised in Canada, so far as I know. So there does seem to be a bit of a cultural difference there. Going forward, what do you think is a big challenge that the Canadian church is going to face in particular?
Well, I think the US and Canada and really the whole Western world are moving in roughly the same direction, which is we are now a post-Christian society. We've just gotten there a little bit sooner than, let's say, the United States. We're certainly into this postmodernism or something like that. And all the respect and admiration that used to come with being part of a church is now gone. It's now a social liability, perhaps, to be part of a church. And so I think as Christians, we're not only a very significant minority in the culture, but we're also not a respected minority in the culture. Meanwhile, the laws of the land seem to be turning ever more away from Christian ethics, Christian morality. There seems to be a movement afoot to really divest Canada of its Christianness, those Christian roots. Not to say Canada was a Christian country per se, but is certainly founded by people deeply steeped in the Judeo-Christian worldview. And it seems now the movement is to kind of look at that and just say, where is God present in this country? Let's remove him for the sake of political correctness or multiculturalism or whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's adjusting to new realities and to being, I presume, more looked down upon.
Right. And is there anything that you think pastors should be doing in particular to be better equipped to reach people in this culture? Or is that itself a bit of a misdirected approach that we need to be super culturally savvy to be effective? Do you recommend us reading certain magazines or newspapers or watching Netflix or movies? How does one become equipped to contextualize the gospel in, let's say, the best sense of the word? Or do you think it's more just a matter of just faithful expository preaching? Where do you position yourself in terms of those ideas?
Yeah, I think if you get to know the people you're preaching to, which is hopefully not just your church members, but also people in the community, as you engage with them, interact with them, share the gospel with them, I hope then you'll start to see that, you're not dealing with the same people you were 20, 30, 40 years ago. These aren't modernist. These aren't people from the modern era where everything was totally rational and you could just challenge them on, I'm going to rationally pick apart your faith plank by plank and then show you how Christianity answers that. That's not the way people function anymore. Not the postmodern kind of mind. And it's also not the mind of many people who have immigrated to Canada. That's one of the things. What is the Canadian mindset now? We have so many because people are coming from all around the world. So you'll meet lots of Muslims, you meet lots of Sikhs, you'll meet lots of people and have to adjust your gospel presentation to meet them where they're at, depending if they're religious, non-religious, and so on. So I think it's just keeping tabs on the people around you, engaging with unbelievers, finding out what their questions are, finding out where they're discouraged, where they are looking for answers, and showing how the gospel of Jesus Christ answers those.
I think that shows how difficult it is, in fact, to be a pastor in Canada, because if you read the research, people who have grown up in the church or are now detached from the church experience a kind of PTSD if they go into a traditional looking church building and the pastor is wearing a suit and a tie. And a church is going to be much more accessible if it meets in a different venue where the pastor is dressed down. But yet, if you talk to immigrant communities, maybe even non-Christian immigrant communities like Muslims, they have a hard time seeing how a gymnasium can be a sacred space, and they have a hard time respecting somebody who's up there in a T-shirt and jeans. And so I know I, as a pastor, I feel kind of conflicted sometimes about how I should be dressing or where we should be worshiping, because of this vast spectrum of opinions. Any wisdom you can offer to me there?
Well, I think a lot of the ethos of reaching into the community, all that came out of the church growth movement, which was specifically targeted at the American upper middle class. The whole idea was go get the upper middle class communities where the money and the influence is, and over time, eventually we'll be able to reach other groups and other populations. But nobody really did, because that middle class, upper middle class, was so influential. It was just they were pretty easy to woo in with programs and stuff that nobody ever got really, I think, to step 2 and step 3. So yeah, I wouldn't want to put too much stock on where you meet, what you wear, all of those things. I don't think you're going to drive too many people off or draw too many people in simply by meeting in a gymnasium or in a rented Seventh-day Adventist church or something. I don't think that's the point. It's reaching into the community personally and drawing people in. And what I said earlier about reaching people with, understanding what questions they have and all of that, that's not so you just start preaching apologetics week by week. It's so as you're preaching expositionally week by week, you know how to point the application, you know how to drive where people are actually, to show them how this passage of the Bible speaks specifically to you, how it can meet your needs, or how it can just counter your presuppositions and so on. So what people need is the Word. They need the Bible. And so what we're doing as Christians is reaching out to people and just seeing how can we best fit the Word to them. What word do they need? How do they need it applied to their lives?
Yeah, I think that's very wise. I'm really fond of what Tim Keller says, that the gospel for the churched and the unchurched is the same gospel. And in my own ministry and with my colleagues, increasingly, we are trying to envision unconverted people in the pew, some of whom are unchurched people, and trying to present the claims of Christ in the clearest way possible. And what we've discovered is that this is tremendously beneficial both to the unchurched person as well as to the person who grew up in the church, who, for whatever reason, may never have really understood the gospel, even though he or she has spent sometimes decades in the church. So yeah, it's not, I don't think there's some kind of magical formula, but it is preaching the gospel of Christ in a very intelligible way.
Yeah, and you've got to understand, a lot of the people you'll connect with or you'll engage with today, even white middle-class people who have been here for generations, they may never have heard the gospel. That wouldn't have been true a while back. They would have somehow heard it. Most people, one way or another, would have heard bits of the gospel at least. But today we're dealing with people who are radically unchurched. It's never been an option. When I met my wife, she had never set foot in a church. She had never heard about Jesus, had never heard the gospel. None of that. That's not unusual. So we can't assume. We've got to be careful with what we assume of people, with our assumptions, with the language we use. A lot of that makes a lot of sense to us, but it's a very specialized and at times technical vocabulary we can leave people behind. And so we've got to understand who is in our communities and be willing to shape our message. We who have a lot of theological knowledge and background have to be willing to have the messages perhaps simplified out of love for others. We'll do fine with more simplified messages, that's fine, but they may not do well at all if they're way too technical and way too theological, or however you want to put that. So yeah, I think there's a good call for pastors to be very winsome and very engaging, very understanding in their presentation of truth.
Yeah, I really like that, Tim. And I've learned over time to recognize a distinction between Sunday preaching and midweek Bible study. And I think there are opportunities in the church where you can dig a little deeper for those who've grown up in the church and want to keep growing and studying God's word and unpacking, scripture. But I'm not sure that the Sunday morning message is always the place to do that, given especially the context in which we live, where there's such little biblical literacy in our communities.
Yeah. You can be critiqued for a lot of things in your preaching. I think, at least in my experience, it's rare to be critiqued for being too simple in your preaching. I don't mean simplistic, but I just mean speaking at a level that's engaging, but that's also relatively easy to listen to and relatively easy to understand and relatively easy to apply. If you preach to people at a very high level, you'll miss a lot of people. If you preach at a slightly lower level, you'll hit everybody. So, preaching doesn't need to be tremendously technical. You can do that at Bible studies. You can dive deep into the you can go as far as you want into the Greek and everything else. But in preaching, you got this great opportunity to reach a very broad and diverse audience. So why wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that you were fond of catechism and, this kind of upbringing in theological education. I'd love to hear from you on whether you think these older catechisms are still useful for discipling people today, or whether the time has come to write a new catechism. Now, I am very familiar with the New City Catechism as well, but maybe reflect with us a little bit on the catechisms of the Protestant Reformation and whether there's still value in using them in discipleship today, or should we take the best of what they offer and repackage it for our day and age.
So I should clarify, I was not necessarily fond of catechism back when I was at the age of being catechized. Like anyone else, I considered it a tragic waste of a Tuesday night. But in retrospect, as an adult, I've been very grateful for it, very thankful for the opportunity, and just knowing that those who are wiser and older than me were the ones who said, you'll be grateful later on in life, so you go and do this. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value still in the historic catechisms, and the beauty is they get translated, right? So it may be we need to update the language, and that's happened several times over the years. You can find various editions of the Heidelberg Catechism or the Westminster Shorter Catechism, whatever you like. I think there's value in something like the New City Catechism as well, though you have to be clear that it's meant to be broad, and so it's written in such a way that it's not specific about things like baptism. It's a mere version of baptism that's not quite the way a Paedo-Baptist would express it, not quite the way a Credo-Baptist would state it, but it's somewhere in between. So I think that's both a benefit and a drawback of something like that. But no, I've never thought that it's time to write new catechisms. I don't think that would necessarily be wrong. But I do think it's important that as Christians in the 21st century, we realize we don't float here alone. We're not the first generation of Christians. In fact, the first thing we should be thinking when there's a controversy in the life of the church is, well, let's see what Christians have said about that. We've got this long legacy, 2,000 years of church history. It seems to me it's wise and humble to look back before we look forward, and to just see how have Christians spoken to this issue or issues like this in the past. So if people are wondering, how do I survive in a pandemic? These are scary times. Everything's topsy-turvy. Well, maybe you're wondering, what is your only comfort in life and death? I've got an answer for that one. And Christians have affirmed it for hundreds of years, and we can now dive into that. So let's take advantage of those resources by all means.
Absolutely. I've asked you about, cultural challenges that are somewhat unique to Canadian evangelicals. Again, as somebody with his ear to the ground, you're reading, you're engaging people. Is there, I want to say, a theological threat on the horizon? Is there something that you see evolving maybe within evangelical churches in particular that concerns you?
Yeah, I think the issue of complementarianism, so the relationship between men and women within the life of the church and within the life of the home, I think that one is, I think for a while we had a pretty good established understanding of what it meant to be complementarian. And now that's sort of being revisited. And you now hear about soft and hard complementarians, that kind of thing. And so just different perspectives on it. So that's not necessarily a bad conversation to have. You know, we never had a creed that the whole church had agreed upon. This is a creedal issue, so we can revisit those things. But I think there can be peril in doing that, and depending how that conversation shapes out. And then I think just matters of sexuality, of course, are on the horizon among Christians. And I don't know that we've done a great job as Christians in equipping our kids for the power of story. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We can give our kids a biblical understanding of sexuality, and, you know, we can do everything from a very formal, here's what the Bible says about man and woman and God's creation of man and woman. We can sort of crack the jokes about it. You know, like we can do all we can to teach our kids, but when their son or daughter comes to them and says, I'm gay, or when their friend comes to them and says, I'm transgendered, I'm not sure we've equipped our kids well for the power of narrative. And that's where I see in wider evangelicalism, people leaving the faith, or at least leaving orthodox views of sexuality, is because they're not equipped for that. When somebody comes to them and looks them in the eye and says, essentially, you either take this part of me and embrace it, or we're done. We're no longer friends, or I'm no longer your daughter. I'm not sure we've equipped people well there.
Yeah, very good. Let me ask you a follow-up question about complementarianism. In my denominational background, women have almost been absent in ministry. And yet, surprisingly, in the New Testament, especially given the age, women are surprisingly prominent. What does it look like in your church, or if that's too personal, what is your vision for women in the church?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Bible is clear that there are distinctions between men and women, and clear there are distinctions not just in the physical bodies of men and women, but also in their role within the home and the church. And so it's clear to me, God has ordained the husband to be head of the home. God has ordained only men to be pastors and elders within the church. I think that's very clear and agreed upon. That's kind of a mere complementarianism. Beyond that, I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful of a couple of things. One is the power of slippery slopes. I think we got to be careful that we don't say, well, if we do this, then this will happen, and this will happen, and then this will happen, versus saying we want to do what the Bible says. And whatever the Bible says, we're going to do all the way, and trust God's not setting us on slippery slopes. So when it comes to maybe women having a vocal role within the church, maybe leading and singing, or maybe reading a supplementary passage of scripture or something. I don't know what it would be in a local church. I think that the question is not, well, will they then want to become deacons, and will they then want to become elders? But the question is, does the Bible permit or invite or demand that as part of what every Christian can do in the life of the church? So I think full obedience rather than operating in fear is really important. There's something else I was going to say, but it's skipped my mind now. But in my church, I mean, we're working this through right now. And I think for a lot of churches, deacons are an issue where, I know what I was going to say is I think we have to be careful not to write off other Christians who come to different convictions than us. So something like deacons. My church has only male deacons, but I'm not going to say if your church has female deacons, we can't have fellowship anymore. I think that's a kind of a third level issue where we can agree to disagree. We can both hold our convictions. We may even have to say, I couldn't be part of your church, or you couldn't be part of mine, but let's affirm one another, and let's see how much we can do together, how much we can co-labor for the Lord despite that difference. So yeah, I think just being charitable to one another in those areas.
That's very beautiful, Tim. You're probably familiar with the fact that in my denominational heritage, the Canadian Reformed churches, we've been quite sectarian in the past, and I really think that's changing. And I see the Lord at work, and we're learning from others, esteeming others better than ourselves. Would you like to see more collaboration between Paedo-Baptist and Credo-Baptist churches? Is that something that should have our attention, or is it okay for us to kind of work alongside of each other, respecting each other? What's the future of those kinds of relationships? As I think probably from both sides there is a kind of growing towards each other without sacrificing doctrinal distinctives.
Yeah. So I think as the Christian world sort of maybe shrinks in relation to the rest of the community, both in numbers and in influence, we need one another more. And so maybe that's drawing us toward one another. If there's only two Canadians in a room full of people, chances are you're going to kind of end up together to talk about what you have in common. And I think some of that is happening within the church. We both believe the gospel, so we can't be picky here in the face of all that's going on around us. Yeah, I think we should move toward one another as much as possible, while also not being naive and trying to move too close together. And so that is a very important distinction. It really does matter, and it influences so much in the life of the local church, because it isn't just whether you baptize infants or whether you baptize only professed believers. There's a whole lot that goes along with it. So most Paedo-Baptists could not in good conscience be members of a Credo-Baptist church, and vice versa. Though Credo-Baptists have the advantage that if you don't have children anymore, you probably can join a Paedo-Baptist church and it'll never come to a head. The other way around is a little trickier, because you have to get baptized or rebaptized depending how you see it. So it is complicated. And I think what we've seen through organizations like Together for the Gospel and Gospel Coalition, these sort of big, wide organizations that are drawing people in, is you see we do have a lot in common. And there are many things we can do together. There are ways we can serve together, parachurch ministries we can support, evangelism, and even just passing members. Like if somebody from my church is moving to Hamilton, do I have to send him to a Baptist church, or could I say, well, you should check out Blessings as well and take a look at that church? Those people love the Lord. So I think just trying to do all we can to foster unity instead of division. Our natural bent, or our sinful natural bent, is toward division. Our gospel bent should be toward unity. So let's just pursue unity as much as we can. And I think that involves just giving one another a voice, giving one another a platform, so we learn not to scare one another away. We see then how much we have in common.
Right. And I think that a lot of our members, Tim, are reading your blog, and they're reading material put out by Baptists, sound gospel Baptists, and really growing from it. And we're always super excited to see that. Our time is running out. Maybe you could just share with us what's on your horizon personally. Is another book in the works? Is there a project that's captivating you presently? How are you spending your time these days?
Yeah, well, we're speaking in the midst of a pandemic now, and I usually do a lot of travel, and that, of course, has been put on hiatus. So I've been bearing down on writing and really enjoying it, just kind of going back to my roots as a full-time writer. And I suspect in the days ahead, I'm going to be doing less travel than I have over the last few years. That said, I am going to be engaging in a project soon. We're well underway, we had fundraised, and we're about to actually start traveling, but a project where I'm going to travel around the world and visit churches that are, I'd say, reformed in their theology and really driven by the Bible, but also also embedded within their culture. And so go to Egypt and worship with a church that's worshiping in some ways in very Egyptian ways, in ways that are consistent with their culture, with their background, and so on. And then go to Papua New Guinea, and find something there as well that is sound theology, but also just trying to worship in a way that's relevant or consistent with the culture around them. So I think that should be a fascinating project, just to show what the Lord is doing all around the world. So I'm hoping to do that one, once we're allowed to travel again.
That sounds amazing. I'm very intrigued by that. I look forward to seeing the fruit of those labors and that travel. Tim, it's been such a delight to chat with you. Thanks for engaging us, for giving up time in your day for this dialogue. We wish you the very best. You're in our prayers, and we just deeply appreciate you being a partner with us in an ongoing conversation.
Well, good. Thank you. And again, just know how much I love and appreciate the Canadian Reformed Church, and have such fond memories and just great hopes that in the future, my church and Canadian Reformed churches and just many of these churches in this area, in this region. We're on mission. We're serving the same Lord. We love the same theology. Let's see what the Lord can have us do together.
Perfect. Wonderful, Tim. Reflections on his time in the Canadian Reformed churches and how he profited from his experiences with us years ago. Our next podcast is going to feature an interview with Bruce Ashford. He is the provost at Southeastern Baptist Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He is a leader among evangelical Baptists who is quite fond of a particular Dutch Reformed theologian. Hopefully that whets your appetite for our upcoming discussion with Bruce Ashford. Please tune in again next time.